This case was supposed to be finished, but the judge just reopened it. After Netflix released The Reckoning, the court took a step no one expected. Diddy's case is back under review, and a life sentence is now back on the table. This isn't a delay. This isn't paperwork. This is the justice system stepping back in after new pressure made ignoring the evidence impossible. What you're about to hear explains why a case everyone thought was settled suddenly became dangerous again for Diddy. And once you understand what triggered the judge's decision, you'll see why this story is only getting worse, not quieter. Before we go any further, I want your take. Do you think Netflix's The Reckoning directly forced the judge to reopen this case, or was this always coming behind the scenes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want clear, evidence-focused breakdowns without media spin, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence now. Let's back to the story. For a long time, this case appeared locked. Motions were resolved, timelines seemed fixed, and public attention slowly drifted away. That's usually the point where legal battles fade into background noise. But something changed the moment The Reckoning went live. Not overnight outrage sustained scrutiny. The documentary didn't just remind people of allegations, it reorganized them. Viewers weren't shown isolated claims, they were shown sequences. Behavior didn't appear accidental, it appeared repeated. And repetition is what courts take seriously, even when years have passed. This is where many people misunderstand what reopening a case actually means. It doesn't mean the judge suddenly believes something new. It means the judge could no longer treat certain elements as settled. When context changes, legal certainty weakens, and The Reckoning changed context in a way that directly intersected with material already on record. That intersection is the key. Legal analysts quickly pointed out that scenes in the documentary aligned with prior testimony, earlier filings, and timelines the court had already reviewed separately. When those elements are viewed alone, they're manageable. When they're viewed together, they demand reevaluation, and judges are obligated to reevaluate when coherence emerges. Another factor that cannot be ignored is visibility. Courts don't operate for public approval, but they are not blind to public documentation. When millions of people are watching the same footage, analysts begin mapping it against legal standards. And inconsistencies are flagged in real time. Pressure builds not emotional pressure, procedural pressure. Pressure to ensure nothing critical was overlooked.
What was he intending to use it for?
I have no idea what he was doing that for.
I mean, you're talking about a man who films himself doing everything and has for decades. I think he wanted someone to be behind
The life sentence aspect didn't resurface randomly. It re-entered the conversation because the framing of impact changed. Earlier considerations focused heavily on individual incidents. The documentary reframed those incidents as part of a sustained pattern. Pattern elevates severity. Severity reopens sentencing thresholds. That's how something once considered resolved becomes reviewable again. Sources close to the process describe the judge's move not as reactionary but precautionary. When uncertainty grows around whether earlier conclusions fully captured the scope of behavior, the safest option is to pause, reassess, and reopen the door before it's too late. Because once a case is permanently closed, correction becomes almost impossible. Another overlooked detail is timing. The reopening didn't happen years later. It happened while related legal interpretations were still fluid, while precedent in similar cases was actively evolving. That matters. Courts move within legal climate, not outside of it. And the climate has changed. What The Reckoning demonstrated is that narrative insulation no longer works the way it used to. Separating incidents, minimizing context, and relying on procedural closure is far less effective when footage reconstructs chronology for the public in a way legal documents never could. That reconstruction forces alignment. Alignment between what was said, what was shown, and what was recorded. Once that alignment occurs, courts are faced with a choice: proceed as if nothing changed, or acknowledge that understanding has deepened. Ignoring deeper understanding risks future reversal, and judges are trained to avoid that risk wherever possible. That's why this reopening matters more than headlines suggest. It's not about punishment escalation alone. It's about whether the original framework still holds. And once a framework is questioned, Every outcome built on it becomes unstable. The life sentence being back on the table doesn't mean it will happen. It means the ceiling has been raised again. And when the ceiling rises, leverage shifts dramatically. Defense strategies change. Silence becomes riskier, and every prior assumption is reevaluated through a harsher lens. This is the stage where cases stop being loud and start being dangerous. Because attention is no longer reactive, it's methodical. And methodical scrutiny doesn't burn out, it accumulates. That's where this case now sits. Not in chaos, not in spectacle, but in reassessment. A place where outcomes are no longer fixed and where every unanswered question carries weight. And the most unsettling part is this. The reckoning didn't claim to show everything. It showed enough to reopen the door, which naturally raises the next question. What happens if more context surfaces now that the court has acknowledged the door was never truly closed? That's where the story's heading. What happens after a judge reopens a case is rarely visible to the public, but it's where the most important shifts occur. The courtroom doesn't suddenly fill with cameras. There are no dramatic announcements. Instead, there's a quiet recalibration of how risk, responsibility, and exposure are being evaluated. And once that recalibration begins, it rarely stops at the point where it started. The reopening itself signals something critical. The court is no longer confident that earlier conclusions fully accounted for the scope of what was presented. That doesn't mean prior decisions were wrong. It means they may have been incomplete. And in legal systems, incompleteness is one of the few justifications strong enough to justify reopening a door that was already closing. This is where the reckoning becomes more than a documentary. It becomes a reference point, not because it introduced new accusations, but because it reorganized existing information in a way that made earlier compartmentalization harder to defend. Compartmentalization is useful in law. It allows complex situations to be broken into manageable pieces. But when those pieces begin to clearly form a pattern, compartmentalization becomes a liability. That's exactly what happened here. Legal observers noted that the documentary didn't rely on one emotional peak. It relied on continuity. Scenes flowed into each other in a way that highlighted repetition rather than shock, and repetition changes interpretation. One incident can be debated. A sequence invites judgment. When courts reassess cases, they're not just looking for wrongdoing. They're assessing sustained behavior and its cumulative impact. Cumulative impact is where sentencing changes live. Earlier phases of the case focused heavily on intent and isolated accountability. This phase is different. The focus has shifted toward duration, influence, and the environment in which behavior occurred. Those elements are harder to dismiss and far more consequential when weighed together. Another layer quietly influencing this process is external expertise. When a case re-enters active review, it attracts attention from former prosecutors, legal scholars, and analysts who are no longer bound by the constraints of the original proceedings. They review timelines independently. They map behavior against standards. They highlight areas where interpretation may have been narrower than necessary. That external scrutiny doesn't dictate outcomes, but it creates a background hum that courts are acutely aware of. Not because of pressure, but because of accountability. Courts know their decisions will eventually be studied, compared, and referenced. Reopening a case is often as much about future defensibility as it is about present accuracy. And defensibility matters most when stakes are high. The life sentence returning to consideration is not symbolic. It reflects a shift in how severity is being measured. Severity isn't just about what happened, it's about how often, over how long, and under what circumstances. The documentary reframed those variables in a way that reintroduced the upper limits of sentencing back into the conversation. That alone alters everything. When the maximum possible outcome changes, strategy changes. Defense teams reassess risk. Silence becomes more dangerous. Prior assumptions about resolution no longer hold. And every piece of material, even those previously deemed marginal, is reevaluated under a harsher light. This is why reopened cases feel so different from ongoing ones. In ongoing cases, everyone expects uncertainty. In reopened cases, certainty is what has collapsed. And collapse creates instability. Instability invites scrutiny. Another critical development during this phase is the reassessment of credibility thresholds. Earlier, credibility may have been evaluated on a claim-by-claim basis. Now it's being evaluated across time. Consistency across years, across platforms, and across different levels of pressure carries enormous weight. The documentary highlighted that consistency in a way legal transcripts alone could not. Visual context changes how memory is perceived. It doesn't make testimony emotional, it makes it tangible, and tangibility is difficult to abstract away. When recollections align not just in wording, but in emotional tone and sequencing, they become harder to dismiss as constructed or adaptive. This is especially relevant when courts consider long-term influence. Influence implies power dynamics. Power dynamics introduce responsibility, and responsibility, when sustained, raises the ceiling of consequence. Another factor quietly shaping this phase is precedent anxiety. Judges are trained not only to decide cases, but to anticipate how those decisions will be viewed in hindsight. History is full of moments where early restraint was later criticized as failure to act. That awareness doesn't push courts toward severity, but it does push them toward thoroughness. Thoroughness often means reopening. The documentary also altered the risk profile of inaction. Once information is widely accessible and coherently framed, ignoring it becomes riskier than engaging with it, not because of public opinion, but because of institutional accountability. Future reviews will ask why certain elements were not reconsidered once context changed. That question is far more dangerous than reopening itself. As the case continues through this reassessment phase, attention is also shifting towards structural questions, not just what happened, but how systems responded. Whether earlier evaluations underestimated cumulative harm, whether frameworks used at the time were sufficient given what is now understood. Structural questions don't have quick answers. They require time, they require review, and they require willingness to admit that understanding evolves. This is why the reopening feels so unsettling to observers. It suggests that the story isn't just unfinished, it's been reframed. And reframing has consequences that extend beyond the original narrative. There's also a subtle shift in language occurring across legal commentary. Words like allegation are being replaced with pattern. Incident is being replaced with trajectory. These shifts may seem minor, but they reflect a deeper change in analytical approach. An analytical approach determines outcome. Trajectory implies direction. Direction implies momentum. Momentum doesn't guarantee escalation, but it does guarantee movement. What happens next will likely unfold slowly. Motions, reviews, quiet adjustments. But slow does not mean insignificant. In fact, the slow phases are where outcomes are locked in. Loud moments capture attention. Quiet ones determine legacy. This is the phase where cases either stabilize under renewed confidence or continue to expand under renewed uncertainty. And right now, uncertainty is winning. The reopening has also changed how the public narrative functions. Earlier, attention spiked around moments of controversy. Now attention lingers around process, around what might happen next, around whether this reassessment will stop where it started or continue outward. That lingering attention creates its own form of pressure, not emotional, but temporal. Time spent under scrutiny increases exposure. Increased exposure increases the chance that additional context surfaces, intentionally or otherwise. This is how reopened cases evolve, not through sudden revelations, but through accumulation. Accumulation of interpretation, accumulation of alignment, accumulation of unanswered questions, and unanswered questions, once acknowledged, don't disappear. They demand resolution. As this phase continues, every decision will be measured against a single standard, whether it reflects the fullest possible understanding of what occurred. That standard is unforgiving, but it's also necessary, because once a court acknowledges that understanding has deepened, it cannot ethically pretend otherwise. That's the position this case now occupies. Not at the beginning of a story, not at the end, but at the moment where understanding catches up to structure. And when that happens, outcomes are no longer about damage control. They're about alignment. Alignment between what was known, what is now understood, and what justice requires under that understanding. That alignment process has only just begun. As the reassessment continues, another shift begins to take shape, one that rarely gets discussed publicly, but often determines how far a reopened case can go. The focus moves from reviewing evidence to evaluating exposure. Not exposure in the media sense, but legal exposure. How many decision points are now vulnerable to reinterpretation? And how many past assumptions are no longer safe to rely on? When a judge reopens a case, it doesn't only reopen facts, it reopens logic. Earlier reasoning is re-examined step by step, asking whether conclusions were drawn from a complete picture or from fragments that made sense only because they were isolated. This is where reopened cases become unpredictable, because logic that once felt solid can suddenly feel fragile when viewed through a wider lens. The documentary played a central role in this widening, not because it accused, but because it connected. Connections are dangerous in legal contexts because they reduce plausible deniability. When actions are connected across time, across settings, and across testimonies, they stop looking incidental. They start looking structural. Structural behavior invites structural accountability. That distinction is critical. Structural accountability does not hinge on one moment going wrong. It hinges on environments being sustained. And sustained environments imply awareness, tolerance, and control. Once those elements enter the conversation, the legal ceiling rises again. This is why the reopening immediately raised questions beyond the original scope. Not new charges, but new interpretations. Courts are now looking at whether earlier frameworks adequately captured influence, power imbalance, and continuity. Those elements were present before, but they were not foregrounded. Now they are. Foregrounding changes everything. Another underappreciated factor is how reopened cases affect witness dynamics. When a case is considered settled, silence is safe. When a case reopens, silence becomes ambiguous. People who once felt there was nothing to gain from speaking may reassess that calculation, not necessarily to accuse, but to clarify. And clarification, when it reinforces existing narratives, can be as impactful as new claims. This doesn't mean a flood of testimony is inevitable, but it does mean the environment shifts from closure to openness. And openness invites reevaluation at every level. At the same time, defense posture changes in subtle but significant ways. Earlier strategies built around finality lose effectiveness. Arguments that relied on the idea that this has already been decided no longer apply. The ground beneath those arguments erodes, forcing adaptation. Adaptation introduces risk, because every adaptation invites scrutiny of why it's necessary in the first place. Another layer influencing this phase is comparative analysis. Once a case reopens under circumstances like these, it is inevitably compared to others. Analysts ask why this case moved and others did not. What threshold was crossed? What combination of visibility, pattern, and timing triggered action? Those comparisons matter because they shape expectation, and expectation shapes tolerance. Tolerance, in turn, shapes outcome. This is where the life sentence discussion becomes more than symbolic leverage. It becomes a benchmark against which severity is measured. Even if the final outcome does not reach that ceiling, the presence of that ceiling influences every step below it. It frames negotiations, it frames assessments, it frames perception of harm. Perception of harm is not emotional, it's analytical. It's based on scope, duration, and consequence. The documentary reframed all three. Scope widened, duration extended, consequence deepened. When those variables change, earlier calibrations no longer hold. Another critical aspect of this phase is the reassessment of normalization. Behavior that may have once been dismissed as contextual or industry-specific is now being examined against broader standards. Normalization is a powerful shield in high-profile environments, but that shield weakens when patterns become visible beyond the context that once justified them. Once normalization fails, accountability expands. This expansion doesn't require new facts. It requires new comparison. Comparing behavior not just to peers, but to principles. And principles are far less forgiving than environments. The court's role at this stage is not to punish preemptively, but to ensure proportionality. Proportionality depends on understanding, and understanding has evolved. Another quiet but influential development is the role of documentation ecosystems. Footage, transcripts, timelines, and commentary now exist in a shared space where they can be cross-referenced instantly. That wasn't always the case. Previously, materials lived in separate silos: legal, our media, personal. The documentary collapsed those silos. Collapsed silos create coherence. Coherence eliminates ambiguity. Ambiguity has long been the defense's strongest ally. When ambiguity fades, defenses must shift from denial to mitigation. Mitigation operates under a different assumption that something occurred and must now be contextualized rather than disputed. That shift alone signals danger, because once mitigation becomes the dominant strategy, the conversation moves away from "did this happen" to "how severe was it?" And severity is where sentences are shaped. This phase also brings increased attention to institutional response. How quickly did systems act? How thoroughly did they review? Whether delays were procedural or perceptual. Those questions don't target individuals, they target processes. But processes shape legitimacy. Legitimacy is a fragile currency. Once legitimacy is questioned, systems respond by demonstrating rigor. Rigor looks like reopening, reviewing, and reweighing. It looks like expanding consideration rather than narrowing it. This is why reopened cases often feel like they're moving backward when they're actually moving deeper. Deeper into context, deeper into consequence, deeper into accountability. As this depth increases, the emotional temperature often decreases. That can be misleading. Quiet phases are mistaken for cooling interest. In reality, quiet phases are where outcomes solidify. Loud moments test reaction. Quiet moments determine resolution. The documentary initiated a loud moment. The reopening marks the beginning of a quiet one, and quiet moments last longer. They allow space for reflection, for comparison, for integration of information that once felt disconnected. They allow courts to act not defensively, but deliberately. Deliberation is slow, but it is decisive. Another aspect now under examination is future risk. Sentencing doesn't only address past behavior, it considers likelihood of recurrence and influence. When patterns are established, risk assessments change, and risk assessments directly influence severity. This is where reopened cases diverge from appeals. Appeals focus on error. Reopenings focus on understanding. Understanding includes risk. Risk reframed through pattern is far more concerning than risk framed through isolated acts. As the process continues, attention will likely turn toward decisions that were once considered peripheral: meetings, communications, power dynamics, and omissions. Not because they prove wrongdoing on their own, but because they complete the picture. Completion is dangerous. Incomplete pictures allow for doubt. Complete pictures demand response. The case is now in the process of becoming complete, not through revelation, but through integration. Integrating what was already known into a structure that makes sense. Once that structure holds, it becomes difficult to dismantle. This is why the reopening feels less like a reset and more like a tightening, a narrowing of interpretive space, a reduction of escape routes. And while outcomes are still undecided, direction is becoming clearer. Not toward spectacle, not toward outrage, but toward resolution grounded in coherence. Coherence is patient, it waits, and once it settles in, it reshapes everything around it. This is the phase where the case stops reacting to the documentary and starts responding to its implications. And implications, once acknowledged, cannot be unseen. What ultimately determines how this case concludes is not outrage, not headlines, and not even the documentary itself. It's convergence. Convergence of interpretation, convergence of responsibility, and convergence of institutional obligation. Once those forces align, outcomes stop being hypothetical and start becoming procedural realities. At this point, the reopened case exists in a different category than it did before. It's no longer a question of whether the system will respond, but how thoroughly it will justify its response. Justification matters because this decision will live far beyond this moment. It will be referenced, compared, and scrutinized as standards continue to evolve. That's why the court's actions now appear measured rather than reactive. Every step taken after reopening serves two purposes at once. First, to ensure the most complete possible understanding of what occurred. Second, to ensure that whatever outcome is reached can withstand future examination. Not public backlash, historical review. Those are very different pressures, and courts are trained to prioritize the latter. The presence of a potential life sentence in this phase is not about signaling inevitability. It's about acknowledging scope. When severity thresholds are reintroduced, it means the system has determined that prior boundaries may not have fully captured the magnitude of impact. That acknowledgement alone changes the entire landscape of the case. Because once the upper boundary shifts, everything below it must be recalculated. This recalculation is happening quietly across multiple dimensions: legal reasoning, risk assessment, interpretation of influence, evaluation of sustained behavior. None of these operate independently anymore. They feed into each other, reinforcing a single central question. Does the current framework still reflect the fullest understanding of harm? If the answer is no, adjustment becomes unavoidable. What makes this phase especially consequential is that it's resistant to fatigue. Public attention may rise and fall, but procedural momentum does not rely on virality. It relies on obligation. Once the obligation to reassess is acknowledged, it must be fulfilled regardless of noise level. That's why this story no longer follows the usual cycle of escalation and disappearance. It has entered a holding pattern, not of inactivity, but of accumulation. Accumulation of review, accumulation of alignment, accumulation of pressure created not by reaction, but by clarity. Clarity is the most destabilizing force in cases like this. It removes ambiguity without needing to introduce anything new. It doesn't accuse, it organizes. And once information is organized into a coherent structure, it becomes difficult to argue that outcomes should remain unchanged. This is where earlier assumptions quietly dissolve. The assumption that closure meant completion, the assumption that time insulated decisions, the assumption that separation of incidents minimized consequence. Those assumptions no longer hold. Another important shift now underway is the redefinition of accountability horizons. In earlier stages, accountability was framed narrowly focused on specific moments, specific claims, specific defenses. Now accountability is being examined longitudinally, across time, across influence, across environment. Longitudinal accountability expands responsibility beyond single decisions and into sustained conditions. And sustained conditions are far harder to excuse. This reframing has implications far beyond this case. It signals a willingness to evaluate how power operates over time, not just how it manifests in isolated events. That willingness reflects broader changes in how institutions understand harm and responsibility. Change like that doesn't reverse easily. As the case progresses, any final outcome will carry a weight that exceeds the sentence itself. It will communicate how systems respond when understanding evolves after decisions are made. Whether adaptability is treated as strength or weakness, whether reevaluation is embraced or resisted, those signals matter. They shape future behavior. They influence how others assess risk. They determine whether silence remains viable or becomes dangerous. In that sense, the reopening has already achieved something irreversible. It has demonstrated that narrative stability is not guaranteed, that reframing can reopen doors thought to be closed, and that visibility, when it produces coherence, can alter trajectories long after initial decisions are rendered. The remaining question is not whether this process will end, but where it will settle. Will reassessment stabilize at a revised understanding that satisfies institutional obligation? Or will further alignment expose additional gaps that require deeper correction? That depends on what coherence reveals next, because coherence has a way of demanding completion. Once a structure forms, it resists partial resolution. Loose ends become conspicuous. Unanswered questions grow heavier, and systems designed to manage risk are compelled to resolve them. This is why the quiet phases matter more than the loud ones. Loud phases attract attention. Quiet phases define outcomes. Right now, this case is firmly in the quiet phase where interpretation solidifies, where frameworks are tested, and where decisions are shaped to endure. Whatever conclusion emerges from this phase will not be accidental. It will be the product of deliberate alignment between what was known, what is now understood, and what justice requires under that understanding. And once that alignment is reached, reversal becomes unlikely. That's the true significance of this moment. Not the shock of reopening, not the fear associated with a life sentence, but the recognition that understanding has shifted, and with it, responsibility. Responsibility that cannot be undone by time. Responsibility that cannot be compartmentalized away. Responsibility that must now be addressed in full. This is no longer a story about whether the system will act. It's about how far it's willing to go to ensure that its actions reflect the most complete version of the truth it now recognizes. And that's what makes this phase decisive. If you've stayed with this breakdown to the end, I want to hear from you. Do you believe reopening this case signals a final correction or the beginning of a much broader reassessment that could reshape how similar cases are handled in the future? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want ongoing evidence-focused analysis that follows stories past the headlines and into the decisions that actually matter, subscribe to The Hidden Evidence. More breakdowns are coming, and the most important parts of these stories are still unfolding.